Hey, what's up, everyone? So it's time to talk about another non-Star Wars magazine that nonetheless contains EU relevant Star Wars content. And today I want to talk about Vortext magazine number 3. This is from the winter of 1992, and Vortext was a fun magazine. There's actually 2 issues that I'm aware of that have EU relevant content. Number 3 is one, and issue number 9 is another. Issue number 9 is actually fairly easy to still get. Number 3, for whatever reason, is just a tougher issue to come across. It's, I don't know, maybe because it's one of the early ones, fewer folks were collecting them or fewer were even published in the first place, right? But harder one to find. Let's start here, both because it's harder to find, it comes before 9, and because, frankly, this is just a fun one to talk about. There is so much stuff in this. The scenario here, or as the author David Ackerman kind of refers to it, more of a situation, is called Ship of Fools. And it's meant to sort of correspond with the West End Games Star Wars miniature campaigns, which was one of the things that a number of the role-playing game licensees have had. Wizards of the Coast had a ton of miniature campaigns. West End Games got that process started, and this is something that's sort of specifically designed to fit with some of the rules and source books related to that element of the West End Game role-playing game Star Wars license. Now, speaking of licenses, I want to sort of say up front that although a lot of these RPG scenarios are sort of officially speaking not canon from the EU perspective, I've made the argument in other videos that there's a certain extent to which a number of them are of at least ambiguous canon to the point that maybe Lucasfilm, frankly, has lost the paperwork. I mean, this is legitimately the case with some of these really early Star Wars stuff. In the cases where, some of these authors and RPG mags just flat out ripped off the IP in order to sort of tell a consistent sort of, West End Games or Wizard of the Coast story. I'd argue that given where we are today in the history of the expanded universe, given the fact that Lucasfilm has sort of like let go of it basically with both hands, occasionally giving us new Legends content, I'd say let's not worry too much about sort of excluding stuff. Let's see what things we can legitimately bring in. And I think given the fact that so much of these ideas you find in these magazines and these stories is really meant to be consistent with the EU, is meant to sort of really meet the EU where it is, that I feel like some of these questions of canon continuity, I just think they're a distraction. Now, again, will I officially state up front that does anyone at Lucasfilm necessarily, officially speaking, consider this part of the EU canon? No. However, what's very interesting is at the very beginning of this magazine, on the first page, where it lists the table of contents and all the things about the stories inside, because a lot of the stories in here relate to other, intellectual properties and other sort of, role-playing games. It specifically states that the use of the sort of the Star Wars name and the Star Wars scenarios here has been, they've been given permission to do this by West End Games themselves. West End Games at the time being the official licensee for role-playing games, for Lucasfilm, right? So there's an extent to which Lucasfilm didn't come to this magazine Vortext to say, do this scenario, and yet they've given the license to West End Games, and West End Games has essentially sort of delegated permission away for the purposes of this story for this issue. So as far as I'm concerned, someone at Lucasfilm might say this isn't officially canon, and yet it seems to have gone through a lot of the sort of similar licensing processes that really everything else from the EU did. So look, without further ado, let's just dive in because there's so much to talk about. There's almost too much to really detail in a sense, because what's interesting about this is that Ackerman really gets into a lot of the non-player characters, right? You learn so much about the background players, the background history. I mean, this goes 300 years deep in terms of the history of this colony. Now, what colony am I talking about? We're talking about Vesla. Now, what's interesting about Vesla is that, although I don't have any way of confirming it based just on this story, Vesla, as many of you probably know, is a system that you hear about in other parts of the EU, including the Old Republic, right? So it's potentially the case that Vesla makes a very early appearance here in 1992 in Vortex number 3. Basically, the story as it's set up. And Ackerman, I should also say, is very keen to say this isn't so much an RPG scenario, the way most of these RPG magazines sort of like have, broad scenarios with a lot more of the outline sort of laid out. This is more of a situation, as he calls it, because again, he really does want to focus on the sort of the broad cultural background, the broad history, and to bring a little bit more life to some of the NPCs that you'd otherwise normally sort of see in these types of role-playing articles. The idea is that 300 years ago, basically 300 years before the Battle of Yavin, some human colonists went to Vesla, and over a long period of time, the colony sort of kind of became corrupted. This kind of elite aristocracy took over, and there was a revolt. And this revisionist, as they call it, capital R revisionist rebellion takes over. And the nobles freak out and they flee in their ship of fools, thus the name of the article, to Jordan, which is a sort of a moon or a nearby planet in the Vesla system. So you've got these nobles who are here on Jordan, flying around in their ship of fools. And it goes into great detail, by the way, about those ships. And we've got an image here of what one looks like on the outside. And we've got some schematics of what they look like on the inside. And that's important because this scenario or the situation actually takes place on one of these. But basically what you've got is you've got the nobles over here on this planet Jordan, and you've got the revisionist government, sort of the rebel government, the revolutionary government back on Vesla. And they're at a loggerheads. The revisionist government knows they need outside help and they need outside trade. And so they reach out to the rebel alliance, not yet the New Republic, for some help. And what's interesting about this is, okay, great. So you're probably thinking, so the whole role-playing game is about what? These ship of fools getting in these battles with one another, right? And the two planets fighting, and can the rebels sort of like help the revolutionary government sort of like overthrow the nobles, or the nobles in with the Imperials, right? It turns out that on the one hand, it's much more simple than that, but I think much cooler, and it kind of in a funny way connects with episode 1. So the main point of this scenario here, or the situation as Ackerman calls it, is simply to hash out a treaty, and really a trade treaty with the alliance and between these two sort of conflicting groups, right? Can the nobles get what they want? Can the revisionist revolutionary government get what it wants, right? That's it. You just hash out a treaty. How crazy, right? And how novel at this point, right? So it's not some big space battle. It's not some big saber sort of attacks one another. You're just hashing out a treaty. But the cool thing is, right, there's a little bit more to it because he adds some other sort of things in the mix, right? There's like a murder on the ship. You got to figure out who did it, right? How is this impacting the negotiations? But again, what's cool is you're completely free to decide not to do negotiations. You're completely free to lie and cheat and have either side sort of deceive one another, right? So it turns out there's a lot more to these negotiations than just sitting down and figuring out, okay, who's going to get what. Now, the connection to episode 1 that for me makes this so exciting, as you're reading through the background here and the scenarios and situations, you're like, wait a minute. For all the fun that gets poked at episode 1 for basically being about a bunch of trade negotiations, right? And what is it? 7 years before that movie comes out, you've got Vortext issue number 3, giving you a really cool scenario, all about how just darn important these trade negotiations are, right? And if depending how you play this out, you can see how it could either lead to war, it could lead to peace, right? And once you sort of see that, you realize just how consequential that opening scene of episode 1 really is, right? If only the Jedi could have convinced the Trade Federation to sit down and talk with Naboo. Who knows? Maybe the entire saga as we know it would have, gone a completely different way. They could have, avoided galactic civil war. This article here, it just goes on and on. There's great illustrations. You get to see some of these trade negotiations at work. You see someone very pointedly sort of across the table looking at others, demanding things, right? Again, even though it's set between this revolutionary force and these nobles, again, you still get a little bit of the Rebel Alliance. You still get a little bit of the Imperials. You see characters from all over. Tons of new characters introduced to the EU through here. There's Baron Marcus Fallon. There's Baroness Marg Hanoan. There's 4 more on this page. You've got more barons, again, more of the nobles that have fled to Jordan in their ship of fools. You got Baron Hu Lightman. You've got someone from the revolutionary government, Jonas Fairblood. You've got an imperial agent there who's just sort of kind of adding some danger into the mix, Janice Fenral. You've got another Baron Burnus Barda. And you've got several more folks on yet another page to talk about. So you've got this person who's also part of the revolutionary government named Pentilus Till Labardanan. Very Star Wars names here, very hard to understand. And then you've got some more NPCs, some minor barons, some minor baronesses, and some house bodyguards. There is just so much here. I could go on forever. So is it worth picking up? Well, it depends. It depends how much you really love this stuff. Do you love games? Do you love trade negotiations? Do you love these non-Star Wars magazines that nonetheless contain EU RPG content? If so, go pick it up. It's harder to find, but when it does occasionally pop up, it's not that expensive. But unlike a lot of these magazines that have this content, what's really great is that there is just some deep background, right? Deep background into the history, deep background into the culture. Lots to work with, tons of new characters. I mean, oftentimes you're basically looking at something that's like a page or two long that maybe introduces one character and then a few other NPCs or something very tangentially. This practically looks like the sort of the sketch for like a new book or something. It's really, really cool and just a fun little piece of Star Wars, RPG history, right? So Vortext number 3, check it out, and I will be back soon with more reviews of more RPG magazines, eventually also doing Vortext number 9. All right, that's it for today. Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.